I never imagined that one day I'd be standing in the freezing snow, holding the city's most untouchable and wealthy bride in my arms while she cried into my coat. But love has a funny way of completely wrecking the quiet life you carefully built for yourself. Before I tell you how a simple midnight phone call changed my entire world, please subscribe to RP Forbidden Romances, like this video, and give it some hype to help bring more beautiful stories to life. My name is Ellen. I'm 32 years old, and I live a quiet, comfortable middle-class life in Boston. I'm a seamstress with a modest but cozy apartment that doubles as my working atelier. I always thought my life was perfectly fine just the way it was, but I was completely wrong. It was a bitterly cold Tuesday night in late November when everything started. The Boston wind was howling fiercely outside my third-floor window, rattling the old wooden frames. Inside, my small apartment was a safe haven of warmth and familiar, comforting scents. The air smelled of freshly brewed dark roast coffee, tailoring chalk, and the soothing lavender oil I always kept in a little ceramic diffuser. Soft jazz was playing quietly from my vintage record player in the corner. I had my blonde, wavy hair tied up in a messy bun, completely lost in my own little world. I've always been proud of the independent life I've built with my own two hands. I'm certainly not rich, but I make enough to live comfortably in a charming neighborhood that sits right on the edge of the city's wealthiest district. In fact, my building is only about 4 blocks away from the massive, gated mansions of the local elite. I usually keep my distance from that world of old money and impossible standards. Their lives always seemed so cold and artificial to me, wrapped in expensive silk, but devoid of any real warmth. I was perfectly content fixing their hems and letting them walk away. That night, I was hunched over my heavy wooden work table, entirely focused on a delicate piece of embroidery. My hands are rough and slightly calloused from years of gripping needles and heavy shears, a stark contrast to the smooth fabrics I handle every day. My neck was aching with that familiar dull stiffness that comes after hours of looking down. Still, I pushed through the exhaustion because I genuinely love the rhythm of my work. The steady mechanical hum of my sewing machine usually lulls me into a state of absolute peace. It was just me, the thread, and the quiet solitude of the late hour. I've always been a night owl, finding a strange comfort in the hours when the rest of the world is asleep. I paused for a moment to stretch my shoulders and look out the frosty window pane. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the dark city streets in a thick layer of pristine white. It looked beautiful, but I knew the temperature outside was dropping well below freezing. I wrapped my thick knitted cardigan a little tighter around my shoulders and took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee. It was the kind of night where you just want to stay indoors and never leave. Then, the sharp, sudden ringing of my landline telephone shattered the peaceful silence of my apartment. I flinched, nearly dropping my ceramic mug on the hardwood floor. I stared at the vintage yellow phone sitting on my kitchen counter as if it were an alien object. It was creeping past midnight, an hour when good news rarely bothers to call. My heart did a nervous little skip in my chest as the loud ringing persisted, echoing aggressively over the soft jazz music. I couldn't fathom who would be trying to reach a humble seamstress in the middle of a blizzard. I wiped my dusty hands on my apron and took a hesitant breath. The cold floorboards chilled my bare feet as I slowly walked across the room. I reached out and picked up the heavy receiver, bringing it to my ear with a lingering sense of caution. I managed a polite but confused greeting, expecting to hear the voice of a panicked friend or a wrong number. Instead, the voice that greeted me was incredibly sharp, profoundly formal, and dripping with an authority that left absolutely no room for debate. It was a woman, speaking with the clipped, polished accent of high society. She introduced herself as the personal assistant to the matriarch of the wealthiest, most influential family in Boston. She didn't bother asking if I was awake, or if I was available to take a job. She simply stated that they had an unprecedented wardrobe emergency regarding a priceless wedding gown. The bride was getting married in a few weeks, and a critical adjustment needed to be made immediately, away from the prying eyes of the press. The assistant quoted a sum of money for one night's work that was roughly equivalent to what I make in 6 months. I was completely speechless, gripping the phone cord tightly in my hand. I tried to politely explain that my shop was closed and that there was a massive snowstorm raging outside. The assistant smoothly interrupted me, her tone turning into a sheet of pure ice. She made it crystal clear that this wasn't a request, but a highly lucrative summons that I'd be incredibly foolish to ignore. They knew exactly where I lived, pointing out that my building was a mere 4 blocks from their family estate. If I agreed, I was to pack my sewing kit and walk over to the service entrance immediately. If I refused, I'd likely never work for the city's elite ever again. A heavy silence hung on the line as I weighed my extremely limited options. I looked around my warm, safe sanctuary, desperately wishing I could just crawl into bed and pull the covers over my head. But the sheer audacity of the demand, coupled with the life-changing amount of money they were offering, sparked a strange fire of curiosity in my chest. Who demands a fitting in the dead of night unless they are hiding a very dark secret? I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves against the intimidation tactics. I told the woman I would be there in 15 minutes. The line went dead instantly, without so much as a basic thank you. I rushed around my apartment in a sudden flurry of anxious energy, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I carefully packed my best needles, my sharpest shears, and spools of premium silk thread into my worn leather satchel. I stripped off my apron and pulled on my heaviest wool sweater, thick denim jeans, and my sturdy winter boots. I wrapped a thick scarf around my neck and threw on my long winter coat, mentally preparing myself for the biting cold. I locked my apartment door behind me, stepping out into the freezing, empty hallway. The icy wind hit my face like a physical blow the second I stepped out of my building. I pulled my collar up against the blinding snow, keeping my head down as I pushed my way through the dark, frozen streets. It was only a 4-block walk, but every step felt heavier than the last, filled with a mounting sense of unexplainable anxiety. Finally, the massive, imposing iron gates of the estate loomed ahead of me through the swirling white storm. I stared up at the towering, brilliantly lit mansion, completely unaware that the woman waiting for me inside those walls was about to shatter my heart and change my destiny forever. The heavy iron doors of the estate groaned as they swung open, letting me step out of the blinding blizzard and into a completely different universe. The immediate shock of the temperature change made my skin prickle under my thick wool sweater. While the streets of Boston were freezing and chaotic, the inside of this mansion was suffocatingly warm and perfectly silent. The air smelled of expensive beeswax, fresh lilies, and an overwhelming sense of ancient wealth. I stood in the massive marble foyer, feeling completely out of place with my melted snow dripping onto the pristine floor. A stiff butler took my wet coat without a word, leaving me standing there gripping my worn leather satchel like a shield. I took a slow, deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The sheer scale of the house was designed to make you feel incredibly small, and it was definitely working. Following the butler down the seemingly endless corridors felt like walking through a museum long after closing hours. Every wall was covered in dark, polished oak and lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors who seemed to judge my scuffed winter boots. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a cold, brilliant light that left absolutely no room for shadows. I thought about my cozy, cluttered apartment just 4 blocks away, marveling at how 2 entirely different worlds could exist so close to each other. The silence in this house wasn't peaceful like the quiet of my sewing room. It was heavy and oppressive. It was the kind of silence that demanded strict obedience and hid generations of unspoken family secrets. My rough hands tightened around the handle of my bag as we approached a set of towering double doors at the end of the hall. I braced myself for whoever was waiting on the other side. The doors opened to reveal a private dressing room that was easily 3 times the size of my entire apartment. The walls were draped in pale silk, and dozens of white roses were arranged in tall glass vases around the room. Standing in the center of the space was the woman who had called me on the phone, her posture rigid and her expression utterly devoid of any warmth. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward a magnificent creation of white silk and lace resting on a velvet mannequin. Even from a distance, I could tell the wedding dress was a masterpiece of haute couture, likely costing more than everything I owned combined. But the delicate side seam had been violently torn, the intricate lace shredded as if someone had pulled at it in a moment of pure panic. I stepped closer, my professional instincts temporarily overriding my nervousness as I carefully examined the damaged fabric. It was a difficult fix, but certainly not impossible for someone with my level of experience. Before I could even open my mouth to assess the damage out loud, the assistant's sharp voice cut through the quiet room. She informed me that the repair had to be completely invisible and finished before the sun came up. There was no room for error, no time for excuses, and absolutely no tolerance for failure. She spoke to me not as a professional artisan, but as a simple piece of machinery hired to perform a sudden task. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral, as I set my satchel down on a nearby mahogany table. I carefully unrolled my canvas tool wrap, the familiar sight of my needles and shears bringing a small wave of comfort to my anxious mind. I asked if the bride would be joining us for the fitting, as I needed to measure the tension of the silk against her living body. The assistant's eyes narrowed slightly, a flash of annoyance crossing her perfectly powdered face. Just as the assistant opened her mouth to reply, a side door softly clicked open, and the breath completely vanished from my lungs. A woman stepped into the bright light of the dressing room, moving with a reluctant, ghost-like grace. This was Louise, the untouchable heiress of Boston's most formidable family, and she was breathtakingly beautiful. She wore a simple white silk slip that clung flawlessly to her sculptural curves, but it was her face that absolutely paralyzed me. She had long, perfectly straight black hair that fell like a dark curtain against her pale, flawless skin. Her lips were full and naturally red, pressed tightly together in a thin line of silent endurance. But it was her deep brown eyes that caught me completely off guard and anchored me to the floor. They were wide, dark, and filled with a profound, consuming melancholy that I had never seen in another human being. I stood there staring at her, entirely forgetting my polite manners and the intimidating environment around me. The gossip magazines always painted her as the picture of high society perfection, a woman who had the entire world handed to her on a silver platter. But standing just a few feet away, I didn't see a spoiled billionaire or a joyful bride eagerly awaiting her wedding day. I saw a delicate bird trapped in an impossibly expensive gilded cage, her wings clipped by the very wealth that surrounded her. The suffocating heat of the mansion seemed to press down on her shoulders, making her look incredibly fragile despite her imposing height. She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive gesture that made my chest ache with a sudden, inexplicable surge of empathy. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for a fleeting second, the cold mask slipped. In that brief moment, I saw a desperate plea for help silently screaming from her gorgeous brown eyes. The intense silent connection between us was abruptly shattered when the assistant cleared her throat loudly. She practically barked at Louise to stand on the fitting pedestal so I could begin pinning the torn fabric. Louise didn't argue, didn't complain, and didn't even sigh as she obediently stepped onto the small velvet platform. The sheer resignation in her movements sent a hot wave of anger boiling in the pit of my stomach. Nobody should look that defeated just weeks before what was supposed to be the happiest day of their life. I swallowed my frustration, forcing my hands to remain steady as I picked up my measuring tape and my silver silk pins. I walked over to the pedestal, suddenly hyper-aware of how close I was about to be to this enigmatic woman. My rough, middle-class world was about to physically collide with her pristine, untouchable reality. As I stepped onto the edge of the platform to reach her waist, a wave of her perfume washed over me. It was an intoxicating, expensive blend of warm vanilla and rich sandalwood, complicated by a subtle hint of winter rain. The scent was so intimate, so uniquely her, that it made my heart do a strange, frantic flutter against my ribs. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the torn silk, terrified of what might happen if I looked up and met that melancholic gaze again. I asked her in a soft, respectful whisper to raise her arms slightly so I could assess the damage to the bodice. She complied silently, her movements stiff and guarded, like she was bracing herself for a painful impact. Even though I hadn't touched her skin yet, the air between us felt thick, charged with an undeniable, heavy electricity. I could hear the faint, rapid sound of her breathing, a stark contrast to her perfectly composed exterior. I carefully draped the heavy wedding dress over her shoulders, maneuvering the expensive fabric to cover her silk slip. As I reached around her waist to pull the torn seam together, the back of my knuckles accidentally brushed against her bare side. The contact lasted less than a second, but it felt like a violent electric shock shooting straight up my arm. Her skin was incredibly cold, sending a sudden shiver through my own warm fingers that I desperately tried to ignore. I heard a sharp, quiet intake of breath escape her lips, and her entire body tensed beneath the white silk. I quickly mumbled a quiet apology, keeping my gaze locked stubbornly on the delicate lace I was trying to pin. My hands were visibly shaking now, my usual professional composure crumbling entirely under the intense physical proximity. I had dressed hundreds of women in my career, but none of them had ever made me feel this overwhelming, dizzying sense of gravity. The assistant pacing impatiently behind us finally sighed, checking her diamond-encrusted watch with obvious irritation. She announced that she had to take a vital international phone call regarding the floral arrangements and would be right outside the door. She warned me one last time to work quickly and flawlessly before she turned on her heel and marched out of the room. The heavy double doors clicked shut behind her, sealing Louise and me alone inside the massive, quiet dressing room. The sudden absence of the assistant's overbearing presence seemed to suck the remaining oxygen right out of the air. The silence that followed wasn't the oppressive quiet of the hallways, but a thick, pulsating tension that made my ears ring. I slowly looked up from the dress, my green eyes finally meeting her deep brown ones in the reflection of the large antique mirror. We were completely alone, and the heavy mask of perfection she wore for the world was beginning to crack. In the quiet safety of the room, Louise's shoulders finally slumped, the rigid posture of a wealthy heiress melting away. I watched in the mirror as she closed her eyes, a single, shaky breath leaving her lips like a deflating balloon. The overwhelming sorrow I had seen earlier was no longer hidden. It was pouring out of her, filling the space between us. I stood frozen behind her, my hands still hovering over the torn silk, completely unsure of how to comfort a woman from a world so far above my own. My heart ached to reach out, to wrap my arms around her freezing shoulders and tell her that everything would be okay. But I was just the hired help, a seamstress brought in from the cold to fix a dress, not a broken life. Still, the pull to protect her, to shield her from whatever had torn this beautiful gown in the first place, was growing stronger by the second. I slowly lowered my hands, taking a tiny, hesitant step closer to her trembling frame. I gathered every ounce of courage I had and softly asked her what had really happened to the wedding dress. Her dark eyes snapped open, locking onto mine in the mirror with a mixture of profound fear and desperate longing. She didn't say a word, but the raw, unshielded emotion in her gaze told me a tragic story of absolute terror. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed loudly in the hallway outside, marching directly toward the closed doors of our private sanctuary. Louise's entire body went rigid, her face draining of all color as absolute panic seized her delicate features. She spun around, grabbing my wrists with her freezing hands, her fingers digging desperately into my skin. Before I could even process the shock of her unexpected touch, the brass handles of the door began to slowly turn. The heavy brass handle of the dressing room door turned slowly, and my heart hammered frantically against my ribs. I instinctively took a step back from Louise, clutching my measuring tape like a lifeline as the heavy wood swung inward. The door opened to reveal an elegant older woman with tired eyes and impeccable, rigid posture. This was Elen, the matriarch of the family, and she looked nothing like the cold villain I had pictured in my mind. She stepped into the room with a weary sigh, her gaze immediately softening when she looked at her daughter standing perfectly still on the pedestal. Evelyn didn't yell or demand explanations for the torn silk, which completely surprised me and eased the knot in my stomach. She simply walked over and gently touched the intact side of the wedding gown, her delicate fingers tracing the expensive lace. She looked at me with a silent, pleading expression, silently asking if the absolute disaster could be fixed before morning. I nodded reassuringly, telling her that the repair would be completely invisible and that she had absolutely nothing to worry about. A small, genuine wave of relief washed over her sophisticated face, making her look incredibly human and incredibly tired. She turned her attention back to Louise, reaching out to gently brush a stray lock of dark black hair behind her daughter's ear. It was a tender, motherly gesture, but I could clearly see the suffocating weight of expectation hiding right behind it. Evelyn softly reminded her that this wedding was the most important event in their family's long history, a union that would secure their legacy for generations. She didn't say it with malice, but rather with the desperate urgency of a woman who felt trapped by her own circumstances. Then, she turned on her heel and quietly left the room, leaving us alone once again in the heavy, charged silence. The moment the door clicked shut, the heavy, suffocating tension immediately rushed back into the expansive dressing room. I walked back to the velvet pedestal, my knees feeling surprisingly weak as I looked up at Louise's frozen frame. She hadn't moved a single inch, still standing completely rigid with her pale arms crossed defensively over her chest. I asked her in a soft, steady voice to take a deep breath and let her arms down so I could finish pinning the torn bodice. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before slowly letting her arms fall to her sides, her deep brown eyes locked intensely on mine. I stepped closer, entirely invading her personal space to reach the intricate layers of silk and shredded lace near her waist. The physical proximity was overwhelming, completely drowning out my rational thoughts and all of my professional boundaries. Every time I reached around her to pull the delicate fabric tight, my forearms brushed lightly against the smooth skin of her bare back. She was so incredibly cold, her skin chilled by the anxious sweat that was undoubtedly gathering under the heavy layers of the gown. I focused entirely on the sharp tip of my silver pins, terrified of making a mistake and terrified of looking back up into her magnetic eyes. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic rustling of the heavy wedding silk as I worked. But underneath that noise, I could distinctly hear the shallow, erratic sound of her breathing, hitching slightly every time my knuckles grazed her skin. I noticed a subtle path of goosebumps rising along her arms, a physical reaction to the cold room, or perhaps to my unintentional touch. I wanted so desperately to wrap my own warm wool cardigan around her shoulders, to shield her from the freezing reality of her impending marriage. Instead, I forced my trembling hands to keep sewing, my heart aching with every single delicate stitch I made. The intoxicating scent of her perfume wrapped around me like a heavy, invisible blanket, completely clouding my usually sharp senses. The rich vanilla and sandalwood mixed perfectly with the subtle, melancholic smell of winter rain, creating a fragrance I knew I would never forget. I found myself unconsciously leaning in slightly closer, drawn to her quiet warmth like a moth to a brilliant, dangerous flame. I was holding my breath without even realizing it, my chest painfully tight with an emotion I couldn't even begin to name or understand. I was just a simple seamstress from a few blocks away, but in that moment, I felt like I was the only person in the entire world who truly saw her. I was almost finished securing the bottom layer of the silk corset when a sudden, violent shiver racked her entire body. The unexpected movement was so sharp that I accidentally pricked my own thumb with a sewing needle, a tiny drop of blood blooming on my skin. I gasped softly, pulling my hand away and looking up in alarm, terrified that I had hurt her or ruined the pristine white silk. But Louise wasn't looking at my injured hand. She was staring straight ahead, her face completely pale and her jaw clenched tight. I asked her in a hushed whisper if she was okay, my voice trembling with genuine, unfiltered concern. She slowly lowered her gaze, her dark, melancholic eyes meeting mine with a raw vulnerability that absolutely shattered my heart. A single silent tear slipped down her flawless cheek, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandelier shining above us. She didn't bother wiping it away, simply letting it fall as a quiet testament to the crushing despair she was being forced to endure. She whispered a tiny, heartbreaking denial, the word barely audible over the loud, frantic beating of my own heart. The flawless mask of the perfect, untouchable heiress had completely dissolved, leaving only a terrified, deeply lonely woman standing in front of me. I completely forgot about the torn dress, the demanding assistant, and the unbelievable amount of money I was being paid for this late-night job. Without thinking, I slowly raised my hand, my rough, calloused fingers gently wiping the tear from her soft, freezing cheek. The exact moment my skin touched hers, a powerful, undeniable electric jolt shot straight through my chest, completely stealing the breath from my lungs. She leaned into my gentle touch ever so slightly, closing her eyes as if my simple hand was the only warm thing she had felt in years. We stayed like that for a fleeting, impossible second, suspended in a quiet, fragile bubble of forbidden connection. I reluctantly pulled my hand away, my fingers burning with the sweet ghost of her touch as I took a respectful step back from the pedestal. I cleared my throat softly, trying desperately to rebuild the professional wall that had just completely collapsed between us. I quickly finished placing the last few pins, securing the heavy silk back into its flawless intended shape. I told her the dress was finally stable, my voice sounding incredibly thick and foreign to my own ringing ears. She nodded slowly, her dark eyes still searching mine for an answer to a question neither of us was brave enough to ask out loud. Just as I stepped down from the platform to pack up my worn leather satchel, the heavy silence of the hallway was violently shattered. A loud, incredibly arrogant male voice echoed through the corridor, complaining bitterly about the freezing weather and the supposed incompetence of the household staff. The heavy double doors swung open aggressively, hitting the wall with a loud thud that made us both jump in absolute shock. A tall man in an expensive tailored suit stormed into the dressing room, his eyes scanning the space with a cold, possessive glare. It was Julian, the groom, and the sheer arrogance radiating from his perfect smile made my stomach instantly twist into tight, angry knots. Julian stormed into the room like a cold winter storm, bringing the harsh reality of the outside world into our quiet sanctuary. He was undeniably handsome, but his features were sharp and completely devoid of any genuine warmth. The heavy scent of his expensive cologne instantly overpowered the delicate blend of vanilla and sandalwood that belonged to Louise. He didn't even bother to look in my direction, treating me with the same disregard he would give a piece of furniture. His entire focus was locked onto the woman standing on the velvet pedestal, but his gaze held absolutely no affection, only cold possession. I watched in silent horror as the beautiful, vulnerable woman I had just connected with completely vanished before my eyes. Louise's posture became impossibly rigid, her spine snapping straight as she rebuilt her flawless, untouchable facade in a matter of seconds. The delicate trembling in her shoulders stopped, replaced by a tense stillness that looked incredibly painful to maintain. She lowered her eyes, refusing to meet his arrogant stare, playing the role of the perfect, obedient heiress flawlessly. My chest ached as I realized this was the mask she was forced to wear every single day of her life. He walked straight up to the fitting platform, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Without a single word of greeting or concern, he reached out and grabbed her waist, his fingers digging possessively into the delicate white silk. It wasn't a gentle touch between two people deeply in love. It was a firm, territorial grip designed to remind her exactly who was in charge. I saw her jaw clench tightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible flinch rippling through her body at the sudden contact. A hot, violent wave of pure anger surged through my veins, an overwhelming protective instinct I had never felt before. Julian began to complain loudly about the freezing Boston weather and the massive inconvenience of having to drive to the estate so late at night. He spoke about the torn wedding dress as if it were a massive personal insult, completely ignoring the fact that his bride was standing right in front of him. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He didn't ask how the delicate silk had been damaged, and he certainly didn't offer any comfort. His voice was incredibly loud and grating, shattering the fragile, intimate peace we had managed to build in that massive room. I stood frozen in the background, my hands clenched tightly into fists at my sides, desperately trying to keep my mouth shut. Louise finally spoke, her voice sounding incredibly hollow and practiced, like an actress reciting lines from a terrible script. She apologized for the inconvenience, promising him that the repair would be completely flawless and that the wedding would proceed exactly as planned. Her tone was submissive, completely lacking the profound emotional depth I had heard just a few moments before. It made me feel physically sick to watch this vibrant, beautiful woman shrink herself down to appease such an arrogant, empty man. I focused all my attention on the remaining pins in the fabric, terrified that if I looked at him, I would scream. He gave a dismissive snort, his hand sliding roughly from her waist to her bare shoulder, his thumb pressing hard into her collarbone. He leaned in close to her ear, his voice dropping to a low, commanding whisper that I could still hear echoing in the quiet room. He reminded her that the entire city was watching them, and that she couldn't afford to make their families look foolish with careless mistakes. It was a clear, unmistakable threat, wrapped in the guise of a pre-wedding conversation. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to throw my heavy sewing shears directly at his perfectly styled head, a violent thought that completely shocked me. Thankfully, before the suffocating tension could escalate any further, his sleek luxury smartphone began to ring, loudly in his jacket pocket. He let out an irritated sigh, releasing his tight grip on her shoulder and stepping back from the velvet pedestal. He checked the screen, his expression immediately shifting back to the cold, calculating look of a high-powered executive. Without another word to his future wife, he turned on his heel and marched toward the heavy double doors, already barking orders into the phone. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving a ringing silence in his terrible wake. The second he was gone, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the room seemed to shatter into a million jagged pieces. Louise let out a ragged, desperate gasp, her hands flying up to cover her face as her rigid posture finally collapsed. The sheer force of her silent sobbing shook her entire frame, the expensive white silk trembling violently around her delicate curves. I didn't hesitate this time, throwing my professional boundaries completely out the window as I rushed forward to the edge of the platform. I couldn't stand to see her in so much pain, my heart breaking right alongside hers in the middle of that opulent room. I reached out, my hands gently grasping her cold, shaking forearms, trying to offer any kind of physical anchor in her storm of despair. I softly murmured her name, my voice thick with an emotion I was entirely unprepared to handle. She slowly lowered her hands, revealing a face completely stained with tears, her dark eyes filled with an agonizing, bottomless sorrow. She looked down at me, the distance between our two entirely different worlds completely evaporating in the heat of her absolute vulnerability. I asked her, begging her in a soft whisper, to tell me why she was doing this to herself. She took a shaky, uneven breath, her gaze dropping to where my warm hands were holding her freezing arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was a broken, devastating whisper that seemed to echo loudly in the quiet space. She confessed that there was absolutely no love between them, that the entire marriage was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated business transaction. Her father's massive corporate empire was secretly failing, and a union with Julian's family was the only way to save them from total financial ruin. She was the collateral, the beautiful, silent prize traded away to secure a merger. The cruel reality of her confession hit me like a physical blow to the chest, completely knocking the wind out of my lungs. I had spent my entire life assuming that the wealthy elite had absolutely everything they could ever want or need. But looking at Louise, trapped in $1 million dress, being sold to a man who despised her, I realized she was the poorest person I had ever met. My grip on her arms tightened slightly, a silent, desperate promise to protect her, even though I had absolutely no power to do so. I felt a profound, overwhelming connection to her, a deep invisible thread pulling our souls completely together. We stood there in the absolute quiet, the harsh reality of her impending wedding hanging heavily in the space between us. She slowly leaned forward, her tears falling softly onto my hands, the distance between our faces shrinking to a mere few inches. Her erratic, warm breath brushed against my cheeks, mixing with the intoxicating scent of her vanilla and sandalwood perfume. My heart began to hammer a frantic, deafening rhythm against my ribs, an impossible, dangerous tension pulling me relentlessly closer to her lips. The world outside the mansion completely disappeared, leaving only the two of us standing on the very edge of a terrifying, beautiful precipice. The silence in that massive dressing room was so heavy, I could hear the erratic fluttering of my own heartbeat. Louise was standing so incredibly close to me that the edges of her extravagant white silk gown brushed against my worn denim jeans. Her dark, tear-filled eyes darted down to my lips and back up again, a silent, agonizing plea hanging in the charged air between us. I knew I should step back, pack up my leather satchel, and walk out into the freezing Boston blizzard without looking back. But the desperate vulnerability radiating from her fragile frame completely overrode my common sense and every professional boundary I had ever sworn to protect. I slowly tilted my head, completely surrendering to the invisible magnetic pull that was drawing our souls together. When our lips finally touched, the entire world outside that opulent mansion completely ceased to exist. It wasn't a demanding or forceful kiss. It was incredibly soft, hesitant, and breathtakingly fragile, like two lonely people finding a hidden sanctuary in the dark. The sheer shock of the temperature difference sent a wild, electric thrill racing down my spine. Her lips were trembling and freezing cold from the stress of the evening, while mine were flushed and burning with a sudden, overwhelming heat. I let my eyes drift shut, entirely consumed by the intoxicating scent of her vanilla and sandalwood perfume wrapping around me like a heavy, luxurious blanket. A quiet, broken sigh escaped her throat, a sound so full of relief and buried sorrow that it completely shattered my heart. She leaned forward, closing the remaining distance between us, and the hesitant touch deepened into something far more profound. I tasted the salty, bitter track of her tears, mingling with the sweet, expensive champagne she had been drinking earlier. My calloused hands instinctively moved from her bare arms to gently cup her jaw, my thumbs lightly tracing the incredibly soft skin of her cheeks. I wanted to pour all of my own warmth, all of my quiet strength, directly into her exhausted spirit. My mind was screaming at me, loudly flashing warning signs about the monumental mistake I was making. She was the untouchable heiress of a massive corporate empire, and I was just a simple, middle-class seamstress hired to fix a torn seam. I was risking my livelihood, my reputation, and my own quiet peace of mind by crossing this forbidden line. But as her fingers hesitantly reached up to grip the thick wool of my cardigan, every single logical thought evaporated into thin air. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I only cared about the beautiful, broken woman melting into my arms. Her grip on my sweater tightened, pulling me flush against the stiff, heavily embroidered corset of her wedding gown. The rustling sound of the expensive silk echoed loudly in the quiet room, a stark reminder of the gilded cage she was trapped inside. Yet, in that fleeting moment, she wasn't a billionaire's daughter or a corporate bargaining chip being traded away to an arrogant man. She was just Louise, a woman desperately starving for a single ounce of genuine affection in a house completely devoid of love. She kissed me back with a sudden beautiful desperation, as if I were the only source of oxygen in a rapidly sinking ship. Eventually, our lungs burned for air, and we slowly, reluctantly pulled away from each other. We didn't step back, choosing instead to rest our foreheads together as we both desperately tried to catch our breath. My chest was heaving, my green eyes locked onto her dark brown ones in the soft golden light of the crystal chandelier. The profound gravity of what we had just done settled over us, a heavy, unspoken realization that our lives were now irrevocably tangled together. Her cheeks were deeply flushed, the melancholic coldness in her gaze temporarily replaced by a bright, burning spark of undeniable desire. But the beautiful illusion couldn't last forever in a place built on rigid rules and calculated appearances. I watched the exact moment reality came crashing back down heavily onto her delicate shoulders. The bright spark in her eyes flickered and died, instantly replaced by a sudden, overwhelming wave of pure panic. She gasped softly, taking a quick, stumbling step backward, putting a safe distance between us as if she had just touched a burning stove. The sudden loss of her warmth left me feeling completely exposed and strangely hollow inside. The cold air of the massive room rushed into the empty space between us, snapping me back to my harsh reality. My hands fell uselessly to my sides, my fingers still tingling intensely with the ghost of her incredibly soft skin. The oppressive silence of the mansion returned, but it felt entirely different now, heavy with the weight of our shared, forbidden secret. I watched her wrap her arms tightly around her waist, instantly rebuilding the high, impenetrable walls of her high society persona. The vulnerable, passionate woman I had just held in my arms was completely locking herself away again. She turned her face away from me, her trembling fingers lightly touching her swollen lips, as if checking to see if the kiss was actually real. I could almost see the internalized shame and the strict, suffocating expectations of her upbringing battling wildly in her mind. She had been trained her entire life to be perfect, to follow orders, and to never, ever step out of line or cause a scandal. Kissing a female seamstress in her private dressing room just weeks before her highly publicized wedding was the ultimate act of rebellion, and it terrified her. I took a hesitant step forward, wanting to reassure her, to tell her that she didn't have to be afraid of me or what we just shared. But before I could even form a single word, she cut me off with a sharp, trembling whisper that stopped me dead in my tracks. She didn't look at me as she commanded me to pack my things and leave the estate immediately. She coldly stated that the dress was adequately fixed and that what just happened was a terrible, unforgivable mistake caused by her overwhelming exhaustion. Her words were like tiny, sharp daggers, expertly designed to push me as far away as humanly possible. The emotional whiplash was incredibly brutal, leaving me standing there feeling completely dizzy and profoundly foolish. I swallowed the thick, painful lump forming in my throat and silently walked over to the mahogany table to gather my tools. My hands were shaking so violently that I could barely manage to buckle the straps of my worn leather satchel. The stark, agonizing contrast between the profound heat of our kiss and the freezing cruelty of her sudden dismissal made my eyes burn with unshed tears. I threw my heavy bag over my shoulder, offering her one last heartbreaking look, but she remained completely turned away, her posture rigid and unyielding. I walked out of the opulent dressing room, navigating the endless, quiet hallways of the mansion feeling like a complete ghost. When I finally stepped out into the freezing Boston night, the blizzard was still raging fiercely, whipping icy snow directly into my face. I walked the 4 short blocks back to my apartment, my lips still burning with the phantom taste of her tears and champagne. I told myself I would simply forget her, that I would go back to my quiet, comfortable life and never think of the untouchable heiress again. But deep down, I knew that was an absolute lie, especially since her massive, highly anticipated engagement party was only a few days away, and I knew she was already unraveling. The days following that midnight fitting dragged by with an agonizing slowness that left me feeling completely drained. I threw myself entirely into my work, taking on more alterations than I could reasonably handle, just to keep my mind occupied and my hands busy. I desperately tried to convince myself that the kiss in the dressing room was nothing more than a fleeting mistake born out of mutual exhaustion and high stress. But every single time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the phantom touch of her freezing lips against mine and smell that incredibly intoxicating scent of vanilla and sandalwood. The memory of her absolute vulnerability was burning a permanent hole in my chest, and I was slowly losing my mind in the quiet solitude of my apartment. By the time Saturday night finally rolled around, The entire city of Boston seemed to be buzzing with an intense electric excitement. It was the night of the highly anticipated engagement party, a massive opulent event being hosted right at the family estate to celebrate the upcoming merger. I certainly hadn't been formally invited to mingle with the elite, but Evelyn had requested my presence on standby, just in case the bride's expensive evening gown suffered any emergency malfunctions. I was strictly instructed to stay completely out of sight, hidden away in a small staff parlor near the bustling catering kitchens. I was nothing more than a silent ghost, haunting the edges of a brilliant world I absolutely didn't belong to. The loud noise from the grand ballroom echoed down the long, polished hallways, a steady, overwhelming hum of classical music, clinking crystal, and wealthy laughter. Sitting in that cramped room, I couldn't resist the overwhelming urge to sneak a glance at the woman who had completely consumed my thoughts for days. I quietly cracked open a side door that offered a discreet, hidden view of the glittering, overcrowded room without exposing my presence. The sheer amount of wealth on display was absolutely sickening, a sea of diamonds and designer suits that felt incredibly suffocating even from a distance. My green eyes immediately began searching the massive crowd, desperately looking for only one specific person. When I finally spotted her, my heart physically ached inside my chest with a sudden, sharp pain. Louise looked undeniably breathtaking in a shimmering silver designer gown that caught the light with every step. But to me, she looked exactly like a beautiful ghost. She was standing next to Julian, who was loudly boasting to a group of older investors while keeping a tight, territorial grip on her delicate waist. Her perfectly straight black hair was styled flawlessly, and her heavy makeup expertly hid the profound exhaustion I knew was lingering underneath. But she wasn't smiling with her eyes. Her gaze was completely hollow, staring blankly at the crystal chandeliers like a woman who was slowly suffocating in a room full of people. Over the course of the next hour, I watched from the dark shadows as she desperately tried to numb her deep emotional pain. Every single time a server passed by with a silver tray, she quickly traded her empty crystal flute for a completely full glass of champagne. Julian was entirely too self-absorbed and busy shaking hands to notice that his future wife was rapidly drinking herself into a state of absolute numbness. She was using the expensive alcohol to build a thick, hazy wall between herself and the terrifying, unavoidable reality of her impending marriage. I wanted so badly to march right into that ballroom, grab her soft hand, and pull her entirely away from all those terrible, empty people. But I didn't move a single muscle. I stayed hidden in my quiet corner, completely paralyzed by my own deep insecurities and the rigid, unforgiving rules of high society. Eventually, the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion became entirely too much for my breaking heart to bear. I told the head housekeeper I was feeling terribly ill and quietly slipped out the service entrance before the opulent party even ended. I pulled my thick winter coat tightly around my shoulders and walked the 4 short blocks back to my apartment in the heavy, falling snow. I felt like an absolute coward, abandoning her to that miserable, gilded fate, just to protect my own fragile feelings. Back in the safety of my own living room, the familiar quiet felt completely different. It felt incredibly lonely and deeply wrong. I turned on my small table lamp, casting a warm amber glow over my heavy wooden sewing table and scattered silk threads, but the warmth brought me no comfort. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, so I just sat in my favorite armchair, staring blankly out the frosted window pane into the dark night. The snowstorm had picked up again, swirling aggressively around the street lamps and burying the quiet city under a thick, icy blanket. I couldn't stop wondering if she was still drinking, if she was still pretending to be the perfect, happy bride for a man who didn't truly see her beautiful soul. It was well past 2 a.m. when a sudden, desperate pounding on my apartment door made me literally jump out of my seat. The heavy, frantic knocks echoed loudly through my quiet hallway, completely shattering the peaceful silence of the incredibly late hour. My heart immediately leaped directly into my throat, my mind racing through a dozen terrifying scenarios as I cautiously approached the small entryway. Nobody ever came to my door in the middle of a blinding blizzard, let alone at such an ungodly, dangerous hour of the night. I took a very shaky breath, slowly unlocking the heavy deadbolt and pulling the wooden door open just a few inches to peek outside. I completely lost the ability to breathe when I saw exactly who was standing, shivering uncontrollably on my humble welcome mat. It was Louise, her incredibly expensive silver party dress completely soaked and ruined by the heavy melting snow that clung to her fabric. She didn't have a winter coat. Her bare arms were covered in violent goosebumps, and her flawless black hair was a tangled, dripping wet mess. She looked completely wild and untethered, her dark brown eyes blown wide and slightly unfocused from the dangerous amount of champagne she had consumed at the party. She had actually walked those 4 freezing blocks entirely alone in the dark, fleeing the massive mansion and the suffocating expectations of her powerful family. Before I could even open my mouth to ask her what on earth she was doing there, her knees suddenly buckled, and she pitched heavily forward. I instinctively reached out, catching her freezing, trembling body tightly against my own warm chest before she could hit the floor. She smelled like a chaotic, heartbreaking mixture of winter rain, expensive alcohol, and that intoxicating vanilla perfume I had been dreaming about all week. She let out a ragged, desperate sob, burying her wet, freezing face directly into the thick wool of my cozy, oversized sweater. I wrapped my arms securely around her waist, pulling her completely inside and quickly kicking the heavy door shut against the howling winter storm. I held her there in the dimly lit entryway of my middle-class apartment, completely overwhelmed by the unbelievable reality of her actually being in my home. She was trembling so violently that her teeth were actually chattering, her freezing hands gripping my sweater as if I were her only lifeline in a violently storming sea. I softly whispered her name, trying to ask her if she was hurt or followed, but she simply shook her head against my shoulder, refusing to let go. She slowly lifted her face to look at me, her dark, tear-streaked eyes burning with a sudden, reckless intensity that completely terrified and thrilled me all at once. The invisible, heavy wall she had built between us in that opulent dressing room was completely gone, entirely washed away by the alcohol and the freezing snow. She didn't say a single word to explain herself or her sudden, desperate escape from the life she was supposed to accept. Instead, she let out a broken, heavy sigh and suddenly pushed herself entirely against me, tilting her head up and crashing her incredibly soft lips directly onto mine. This wasn't the incredibly gentle, hesitant kiss we had shared at the estate. This was impossibly deep, fiercely hungry, and fueled by pure, unadulterated desperation. Her freezing fingers tangled fiercely into my messy blonde hair, pulling me closer with an undeniable, intoxicating strength that made my knees feel entirely weak. I gasped softly against her lips, entirely consumed by the blinding heat of her sudden surrender, knowing with absolute certainty that there was no turning back from this beautiful, dangerous disaster. I stumbled backward against the hallway wall, completely caught off guard by the sheer force of her kiss. The heavy, freezing fabric of her ruined silver dress pressed wetly against my thick wool sweater, soaking right through to my skin. But I couldn't feel the biting cold at all. The only thing I registered was the blinding, intoxicating heat of her mouth, moving desperately against mine. My hands instinctively found her waist, pulling her closer as the howling wind rattled the window panes of my modest apartment. It was a chaotic, dizzying collision of 2 entirely different worlds, fueled by the champagne on her breath and the undeniable longing we had both been suppressing. She tasted like expensive alcohol, salty tears, and the sweet, forbidden promise of an entirely different life. We broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, our chests heaving in the dim amber light of the entryway. She was shivering so violently that her teeth were chattering, the melted snow dripping continuously from her incredibly dark hair onto my hardwood floor. I knew I had to get her out of those freezing, ruined clothes before she caught a terrible fever. I gently took her trembling hand, my rough fingers wrapping around her soft, icy ones, and quietly led her away from the front door. We walked slowly down the short hallway toward my small bedroom, the heavy silence of the apartment wrapping around us like a protective cocoon. Every step felt incredibly surreal, like I was walking through a beautiful, dangerous dream that I never wanted to wake up from. My bedroom is incredibly simple, with an old iron bed frame, faded cotton sheets, and a single warm lamp glowing softly on the nightstand. It was a million miles away from the opulent, suffocating luxury of her family's massive estate. But as she looked around the small room, her dark eyes filled with absolute relief. I quickly grabbed a thick, dry towel from my closet and gently draped it over her trembling shoulders, trying to offer some immediate warmth. I nervously asked her if she wanted me to turn around so she could peel off the soaked designer dress in private. Instead of answering, she simply let out a quiet, shaky sigh and reached for the hidden zipper at the base of her spine. Her fingers were trembling entirely too much to grasp the tiny metal clasp, her frustration visible in the tight clench of her jaw. I slowly stepped closer, silently offering my help, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I brushed her freezing hands away with a gentle touch, taking over the delicate task of unzipping the heavy, ruined silk. Her flawless pale skin covered in a violent rash of goosebumps from the freezing winter air. I quickly wrapped the thick towel entirely around her, pulling the edges tight across her chest to trap my own body heat against her shivering frame. She looked up at me through her damp, messy eyelashes, her expression so incredibly raw and completely stripped of her high society armor. She whispered that she couldn't go back there, that the mere thought of marrying Julian made her want to disappear entirely from the face of the earth. Her voice was thick with exhaustion and the lingering effects of the champagne, but her words were brutally, undeniably honest. I gently brushed a wet strand of black hair away from her cheek, my thumb lingering softly against her incredibly cold skin. I promised her she was safe here, that absolutely nobody in the entire world knew where she was, and that the storm outside would keep everyone else away. She leaned into my touch, closing her eyes as a long, shaky breath finally escaped her trembling lips. In that quiet, dimly lit bedroom, she wasn't an untouchable billionaire heiress. She was simply a woman desperately seeking a safe harbor in the middle of a terrible storm. The heavy towel slipped slightly from her shoulders as she reached her arms up, wrapping them tightly around my neck and pulling me down to her level. This time, the kiss wasn't frantic or fueled by desperate panic. It was incredibly slow, deliberate, and burning with a profound, quiet passion. Her lips were finally starting to warm up against mine, parting softly to invite me deeper into the intoxicating sanctuary of her embrace. I felt my knees go completely weak as her soft fingers tangled into the messy blonde hair at the nape of my neck. We moved seamlessly together, taking a few slow, stumbling steps backward until the back of her knees hit the edge of my mattress. We fell onto the faded cotton sheets together, the old iron bed frame creaking softly in the quiet room. The contrast of her flawless, incredibly soft skin against my rough, calloused hands was absolutely mesmerizing as I gently traced the curve of her waist. Every single place I touched seemed to catch fire. The heavy scent of vanilla, sandalwood, and winter rain filled my senses, drowning out every single rational thought I had left in my spinning mind. I kissed my way down the graceful curve of her jaw, feeling her frantic pulse beating wildly against my lips. She whispered my name like it was a sacred prayer, her voice trembling with an emotion so deep and profound, it brought hot tears to my own eyes. It was a secret, forbidden worship in the dark, a desperate collision of two lonely souls finally finding their missing half. I wanted to show her what it felt like to be truly cherished, to be touched with genuine reverence instead of cold, arrogant possession. I remembered the harsh, territorial way Julian had grabbed her waist during the fitting, and it fueled my overwhelming desire to give her the absolute opposite. My touches were incredibly gentle, painfully slow, worshipping every single inch of her skin as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the universe. She melted completely under my hands, shedding the rigid, suffocating expectations of her wealthy family with every soft kiss and shared breath. The walls of my small bedroom felt like an impenetrable fortress, protecting our fragile, beautiful secret from the cruel, demanding city outside. We were completely lost in each other, trading soft whispers and heated glances in the warm, amber glow of the bedside lamp. The intoxicating heat between us continued to build, a slow, beautiful burn that, chased away the lingering chill of the Boston blizzard. We tangled our limbs together under the heavy wool blanket, seeking absolute closeness in a world that had always forced us to remain completely apart. Her soft gasps and quiet, encouraging murmurs were the only sounds in the room, creating a perfect, intimate symphony that I wanted to memorize forever. There was no rush, no pressure, and absolutely no expectations. Just the pure, unadulterated joy of discovering the profound depth of our physical and emotional connection. Every single kiss felt like a profound confession, a silent promise that I would do absolutely anything to keep her safe from the life she was running away from. It was the most beautiful, terrifying, and completely perfect night of my entire existence. Eventually, the overwhelming tide of our shared passion reached its beautiful. We lay there tangled together in the messy sheets, our chests rising and falling in perfect, peaceful synchrony. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling fiercely against the frosted glass. But inside, the atmosphere was incredibly calm and perfectly still. I pulled the thick blanket higher over her bare shoulders, tucking her securely against my side so my body heat could keep her entirely warm. She rested her head heavily on my chest, her dark hair spilling across my pale skin like a beautiful, messy river of silk. I gently stroked her back, feeling the tension completely drain out of her exhausted muscles. The dangerous amount of alcohol she had consumed, combined with the massive emotional crash of her escape, finally began to catch up with her. I felt her breathing slowly even out, growing deep and rhythmic as the heavy weight of absolute exhaustion pulled her down into a deep sleep. I stayed awake for a long time, simply holding her in the quiet dark, entirely captivated by the peaceful, unguarded expression on her beautiful face. Without the heavy makeup and the crushing expectations of her family, she looked so incredibly young and heartbreakingly fragile. I pressed a very soft, lingering kiss to the top of her head, silently promising the universe that I would fight tooth and nail to protect this newfound happiness. I had finally found the one thing in my quiet, simple life that I was entirely willing to risk absolutely everything for. My eyelids eventually grew incredibly heavy, the comforting warmth of her body lulling me into a state of profound, peaceful rest. I let my eyes drift shut, my fingers still loosely tangled in her dark hair, feeling like the luckiest person on the entire planet. But even as sleep finally claimed me, a tiny dark sliver of anxiety began to curl in the very pit of my stomach. This beautiful sanctuary was only temporary, a stolen moment in time that was completely hidden by the dark night and the heavy blizzard. I knew that the sun would inevitably rise, melting the snow and bringing the harsh, unforgiving reality of Boston's elite crashing directly down on our heads. I just had absolutely no idea how terrible the morning light was going to be, or how quickly our perfect bubble was about to violently burst. I pulled my sharpest tailored gray wool blazer over my shoulders, my hands moving with a frantic but calculated precision. I am a highly successful businesswoman, someone who commands respect in the most exclusive fitting rooms in this city, and I needed every ounce of that authority right now. I quickly grabbed my premium leather work bag, throwing a few rolls of expensive silk and my measuring tapes inside to create the perfect professional alibi. My heart was hammering a violent rhythm against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to steady as I locked the heavy door of my upscale loft behind me. I couldn't let my overwhelming emotions cloud my judgment when the woman I cared about was walking directly into a high society firing squad. The short 4-block walk to the massive estate felt entirely different in the blinding light of the harsh winter morning. The fierce blizzard had finally broken, leaving the affluent Boston streets covered in a thick, blindingly bright layer of pristine white snow. The freezing air bit sharply at my cheeks, but the intense protective fire burning inside my chest kept the winter chill completely at bay. I kept my chin high and my strides incredibly purposeful, mentally preparing myself to face the most powerful family in the state. Every single step I took was fueled by the memory of her dark brown eyes and the terrified, heartbreaking way she had run out of my home. When I finally reached the towering iron gates of the estate, The absolute chaos of the morning was already spilling out into the driveway. Black luxury SUVs were parked haphazardly near the entrance, and the usually stoic security guards were frantically speaking into their radios. The estate staff looked completely panicked, rushing across the snow-covered courtyard like a kicked anthill, desperately searching for any sign of their missing heiress. Nobody paid any attention to the confident, well-dressed woman walking purposefully up the main driveway with a designer leather bag over her shoulder. The sheer panic vibrating through the freezing air confirmed my worst fears. They knew she had been missing all night, and the fallout was going to be completely catastrophic. I used my established status as the city's premier dressmaker to completely bypass the distracted butler at the grand front entrance. I confidently stated that I was summoned for a final emergency consultation regarding the wedding gown, and he simply waved me through without a second glance. The suffocating, artificially warm air of the mansion immediately hit my face, a stark contrast to the freezing winter morning outside. I walked down the incredibly long, polished marble corridors, my expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the floor in a steady, determined rhythm. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I simply followed the loud, echoing sounds of angry voices bouncing off the high, painted ceilings. The frantic shouting grew significantly louder as I approached the massive, incredibly ornate double doors of the main formal living room. I recognized Julian's grating, arrogant voice immediately, cutting through the heavy tension of the house like a jagged, rusty knife. He was absolutely furious, yelling about the massive public embarrassment and the sheer audacity of a bride vanishing in the middle of her own engagement party. Underneath his loud, booming voice, I could hear the trembling, distressed tone of Elen, desperately trying to calm the incredibly volatile situation. I slowed my pace, creeping silently toward the partially open doors, my breath catching painfully in the back of my throat as I finally looked inside. The grand living room was a breathtaking display of unimaginable wealth, decorated with priceless antique furniture, towering crystal chandeliers, and massive oil paintings. But in that terrifying moment, it looked exactly like a beautiful, inescapable prison designed to completely crush the spirit of anyone trapped inside. Evelyn was pacing frantically near a massive stone fireplace, wringing her elegant hands together as tears streamed down her perfectly powdered face. Julian was pacing like a caged, furious animal, his expensive suit jacket thrown carelessly over a velvet chair as he barked angry accusations. And standing completely alone in the center of the opulent room was Louise, looking incredibly small and entirely overwhelmed by the suffocating pressure. She was still wearing the tailored navy coat and dark trousers she had hastily grabbed from my expansive walk-in closet just an hour ago. The modest, impeccably tailored clothes looked entirely out of place in that sea of extreme luxury, a glaring, undeniable physical proof that she had been somewhere else. Her perfectly straight black hair was a tangled, messy curtain hiding the sides of her face, and her fair skin was drained of absolutely all color. She had her arms wrapped tightly around her own waist, holding onto my wool coat as if it were the only thing keeping her from completely shattering into pieces. My heart physically ached for her, completely breaking at the sight of this incredibly beautiful, powerful woman shrinking into herself under their cruel gaze. Julian stopped his angry pacing and marched aggressively toward her, invading her personal space with a terrifying, undeniable hostility that made my blood boil. He pointed a sharp finger directly at her face, loudly demanding to know exactly whose apartment she had been hiding in all night long. He sneered at her wrinkled clothes, loudly complaining that she smelled like someone else's expensive coffee and an unfamiliar, completely foreign laundry detergent. He didn't care if she was emotionally struggling. He only cared that his prized possession had temporarily stepped out of line and embarrassed him. I gripped the thick wooden door frame with white-knuckled intensity, using every single ounce of my professional restraint to keep myself from charging into the room and breaking his jaw. Elen rushed forward, gently, pushing the furious groom aside so she could reach her completely terrified daughter. The older woman grabbed Louise by the shoulders, her voice completely thick with a mother's genuine, desperate panic and overwhelming relief. She frantically asked if she had been kidnapped, if someone had hurt her, or if she was suffering from some kind of terrible, unexpected nervous breakdown. Evelyn's tears were real, but her suffocating grip on her daughter's arms only seemed to push Louise deeper into her terrifying state of frozen shock. The extreme contrast between the mother's desperate worry and the groom's wounded toxic pride created an incredibly volatile, dangerous atmosphere in the room. Louise didn't say a single word to either of them. She just stood there trembling violently, like a fragile leaf caught in a brutal winter storm. Her deep brown eyes darted wildly around the massive room, completely trapped, desperately searching for an escape route that simply didn't exist in that house. I could clearly see the exact moment the heavy, crushing weight of her billion-dollar reality completely paralyzed her vocal cords. She was incredibly hungover, deeply traumatized, and entirely incapable of defending herself against the two people who controlled her entire existence. She was completely drowning in a sea of toxic expectations, and she had absolutely no idea how to swim back to the surface. Julian completely lost whatever tiny shred of patience he had left, stepping uncomfortably close to her and completely ignoring Evelyn's desperate pleas for calm. He grabbed Louise roughly by the upper arm, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of red as he leaned directly into her personal space. He lowered his voice into a terrifying, commanding growl that echoed loudly against the expensive marble walls and crystal fixtures. He demanded to know exactly where she had been, promising absolute ruin for whoever had dared to shelter his future wife from her highly publicized duties. The sheer, unadulterated venom in his voice sent a cold, terrifying shiver directly down my spine as I watched from the hidden shadows of the hallway. He gave her arm a slight, demanding shake, yelling the ultimate question one final time, completely demanding an immediate, acceptable answer. Louise slowly opened her trembling lips, her chest heaving with a sudden, desperate panic, but absolutely no words managed to escape her dry throat. She looked entirely broken, completely consumed by the deep, paralyzing fear of what would happen to me if she actually told them the truth. A heavy, suffocating silence suddenly crashed down over the massive living room, cutting through the incredibly tense air like the sharp blade of a guillotine. It was the exact, terrifying moment I realized that if I didn't step through those doors right now, they were going to completely destroy her. The continuation of this story will be available very soon on our channel.